Finally, today we want to take a look at checks that the other branches have on the president. So we'll look at powers that the legislative branch has and powers that the judicial branch has that can limit the powers that the president has. So what we're seeing in the picture here, poor President Biden has learned that the national parks are closed because of a government shutdown. So we'll learn a little bit about government shutdowns as a form of a check on the president, as well as all of the other ways that the branches can limit the power of what the president does. The first and most obvious check on the president would be the impeachment power. Congress has the ability to impeach the president for crimes. It is important that the Constitution says that the president can be impeached for treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. It says that the president must be, he can be removed from office for a crime, not because the president is too conservative or too liberal or won't cooperate with Congress, but the president must be impeached for committing a crime and not for political reasons here. We learned all about this in the Congress section, but we know that the House and Senate have different roles here. The House is responsible for impeaching the president. That means they bring the charges against the president. The Senate is responsible for holding the trial, the impeachment trial, and the senators vote at the end of the impeachment trial. And if 3/4 of the senators agree to remove the president, then the president will be removed from office. Another check that Congress has on the president is Congress has the ability to override the presidential veto. So this requires both houses of Congress to vote at a very, very high supermajority, at a 2/3 supermajority. But if the president vetoes a law, then Congress gets another chance to pass that law. They'd have to do that by overriding the president's veto. We mentioned earlier this is insanely rare. Only 4% of the time has this happened in the history of the country. But 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate can vote. That will almost certainly mean that Republicans and Democrats both have to agree to override the president's veto here, and is insanely rare. The times we're most likely to see this are when Congress is passing a law that limits the president's power. So that way the president, of course, would veto a law that would limit the president's power, but Congress, one of the few things that the opposing parties in Congress could agree on is that they want to protect their own power over the president. One of the big checks that the legislative branch has over the president is the advice and consent power. Now, these are actually powers of Congress, but they're in Article 2 because it says the president can do these with the advice and consent of Congress. And this is about the things that the Senate must approve, the presidential actions that must get the approval of the Senate. And Senate approval is necessary for all sorts of presidential actions, from treaties to appointments. So first of all, we know that treaties must be ratified by a vote in the Senate. So the president has the ability to negotiate treaties with foreign countries, but it's up to the Senate to vote on whether or not those will actually go into effect. The Senate also gets approval for every ambassador to any ambassador that the president appoints to any other country. And the president makes his cabinet appointments, but the Senate has approval of all of those as well. So the Senate must approve all the cabinet appointments. And along with this, we know that the Senate is going to have approval over all of the judges that the president has also appointed. So appointments to embassies, appointments to the cabinet, and appointments to the federal judiciary are all subject to the advice and consent of the Senate. Other bureaucratic appointments are also subject to the approval of the Senate. Now, there are all sorts of agencies, which we'll get into later, that aren't necessarily cabinet departments, but that the person chosen as their head must be approved by the Senate, such as like the Environmental Protection Agency. If the president is going to appoint a person to run the EPA, that person must be approved by the Senate too. If no one has been approved by the Senate, then the president just names an acting head, and that person is the acting, head of the Environmental Protection Agency or whatever agency until a permanent one is approved by the Senate. So this is an important check that the legislature has over the president. Another check that the Congress has over the president is the power of the purse, the power to control spending. We know that Congress controls the federal government's spending. Congress gets to make the budget, and Congress controls appropriation, or the actual distribution of money. So if they disagree with a presidential action, they can refuse to fund it. This happened repeatedly in Trump's term in office, as Trump continuously tried to build a wall on the border between the United States and Mexico, and Congress would repeatedly refuse to give that project any funding. So the president wants to do it, but there's no actual money for that program to go ahead. This is one way that the Congress can limit what the president wants to do. Now, for budget writing, the Congress is going to actually write the budget, but they have to consider the president's proposal. So the president's proposal gives an idea of what the president wants to see, and they know that the president can veto the budget. But in general, Congress can make all sorts of changes to the budget that they want to. So Congress has tremendous control over the federal government spending, and that puts big time limits on what the president is able to accomplish. Related to spending is the idea of government shutdowns. If we get to a point where the president and Congress absolutely will not agree on a final budget by a specific deadline, then the government is shut down. Now, these deadlines change based on the previous budget, but if we get to a point where there is no approved budget, the president refuses to agree with Congress's budget, then that's going to shut down the national government. And when that happens, that's what was going on in the picture there. All non-essential functions of the government are stopped until both parties can agree on a final budget. So things that are non-essential in the picture at the beginning of this section, that was the Lincoln Memorial. And since it's a national park, national parks are not essential. We don't have to have those every single day. So if the government does not have any money to fund itself, services like that are going to stop. And so services in all different levels of government are stopped. Like the IRS won't be processing tax returns. Inspections won't be handled by the EPA of factories and things like that. But essential functions will continue. Like we'll still deliver the mail. There will still be a military. Congress and the president must still continue to work so that they can find a solution to this problem. But we would call government shutdown a check on the president because often the public is going to blame the president for the shutdown. And this is going to cause the president's approval ratings to drop. And that's a number that the presidents will pay a lot of attention to. But the public tends to blame the president for this sort of thing. Not always, but usually the public in general, we want the president to be in charge of stuff. And so if the government is shut down, we blame the person at the top. And that's why the public would tend to put the blame of a shutdown on the president. And of course, the judicial branch has a check on the president as well. This is their check on everyone, but the judicial branch has the power of judicial review. The federal courts have the ability to declare the actions of the president unconstitutional. So if the courts rule that the president is doing something illegal, they can stop it. In this case, the president, what courts can do is they often issue what we call injunctions, which is a court order to stop something from happening. So if the president wants to do something, the courts may step in and say, no, you actually can't do that. If it's a lower court, like a district court, and they tell the president that the president has to stop that action, then the president can appeal just like anyone else, but the Supreme Court has the final say. If the Supreme Court tells the president no, or that some action is unconstitutional, they have limited the power of the president to act. All right, one more topic to cover today that's not really in the Constitution specifically, but is an important presidential power. We're going to discuss the idea of executive privilege. So here, you can see President Obama down at the bottom left of the screen, meeting with a bunch of his close advisors, and they're making important decisions. We're going to talk about how the president can keep this information to themselves, and this serves as a way to protect their information from investigations by Congress. Here's President Trump and some of his close advisors. They're giving the president advice on what should happen, and the president is able to claim executive privilege on the information shared in this meeting. That means that the president has the ability to withhold information from the public and from Congress and from the courts if this information is about national security. So this is not just for the president, but this includes other members of the executive branch too. If someone is advising the president, then that person is going to be covered by executive privilege. These people, the president and their teams are able to resist subpoenas to come testify before court. They're able to resist subpoenas to present evidence. And they're able to resist investigation in this way. So this serves as an important power that the president has when facing investigation from Congress. The Supreme Court has argued that executive privilege is fine, and executive privilege is part of the separation of powers. So this is a legal power of the president to withhold this information. So executive privilege means that the president and their staff don't have to reveal the detail of what kind of meetings or conversations go on behind closed doors. They don't have to reveal all of the information that they know about everything. If this privilege didn't exist, then advisors to the president would not necessarily be able to share the best information. They'd always have concerns about future investigations or possible punishment for information that they shared with the president. People would always be afraid of having to testify before Congress or testify in court in a way that got them in trouble. So executive privilege is important this way because it helps make sure that the president gets the best information. This covers things that deal with national security. So that's why the president is able to claim that these are important things, right? The most important priority of the government is to keep us safe. And so while it is important that Congress is able to investigate the executive branch and see what they're doing, we want to prioritize the safety and security of the country in a way that ensures that the president is still getting access to the best information. So this power of the president serves as a check on Congress's oversight power. When we were talking about Congress, we talked about their power of legislative oversight, meaning that they are monitoring the executive branch to make sure the executive branch is operating appropriately. So this is where Congress, in their committees, they may be holding hearings, and they're going to investigate the actions of members of the executive branch, the federal bureaucracy. Just like a court, Congress has the power to subpoena evidence. They have the power to subpoena people and make them testify under oath. So this is a power that the legislative branch has as a check over the executive branch. So the legislative branch has this important check to investigate the executive branch. But executive privilege gives the executive branch another important check on this congressional power. So this is, I know, very confusing, but oversight is a check that Congress has on the president. Executive privilege is a check that the president has on congressional oversight. And there are, of course, limits to executive privilege. We have this very important court case that occurred during the Watergate investigation here. This was the United States versus Richard Nixon. So the government suing the president. During the Watergate investigation, it came out that Nixon had a recording system installed in his office. He wanted to record every conversation that he ever had. And so when Nixon got in trouble as part of the Watergate scandal and Congress found this out, well, that is a really important piece of evidence. If we have every White House conversation recorded. In the Watergate investigation, the Congress subpoenaed these recordings, but Nixon refused. He's like, I'm not going to turn over these tapes. That's executive privilege. These are all my private conversations. But the Supreme Court, this goes to the Supreme Court. Congress says, give us those tapes. And Nixon says, I can't give you the tapes. It's executive privilege. But the Supreme Court ruled in this case, U.S. versus Nixon, that Nixon had to give Congress the tapes. This is where they drew a line and said, executive privilege is important, but it only works for national security. Everything on those tapes could not be national security related, so those tapes were turned over to Congress, and they went forward with the Watergate investigation here. This court case tells us, like, it's important for Nixon, but it's important for all presidents because it tells us that the president does not have the absolute power to withhold all kinds of information. So presidents are required to do things like send members of their staff to testify before Congress and testify under oath. They are required to produce some evidence, but executive privilege allows them to protect information related to national security. All right, that's it for today. Let's take a look at our big ideas, tiny desk time. Here's President Trump hanging out at a tiny desk recently as we go through the most important things we want to remember about presidential powers. So for all of our sets of notes today, you guys want to make sure that you are able to point out which powers of the president come from the Constitution. We're going to be asked to describe those powers all the time. So it might be like, describe the power of the president to act as commander-in-chief, describe the president's pardon power, something like that. These are the kind of things that we're going to find in those scenarios that we've been looking at on tests. So when we do the AP test, we're probably going to be confronted with a scenario where we might have to pick out a power that the president has that they are using in the story. We also want to make sure that we know the president's checks on Congress. The president has a lot of checks on Congress. Congress has a lot of checks on the president, so we need to make sure we can describe those as well. So we want to be able to describe powers that the president has over Congress. We want to be able to describe powers that the president has, that the president can be limited by powers that Congress has. So what limits exist on the president? And finally, sometimes executive privilege will pop up on this AP exam. So we want to make sure that we understand what executive privilege means and explain why that is a check on Congress's power. So what we've done today is we've gone through all of the different presidential powers and the ways that the president can interact with other branches. As we move forward, we're going to start to look at the ways that the president's power has expanded over time. The presidents of today are way more powerful than President George Washington. So we're going to look at what has caused that power to grow.